Israel's so-called deal of the century was announced late January 2020. The deal basically imposes the will of the Israeli regime and the U.S. on the indigenous population, the Palestinians, in a bid to eliminate their cause and any hope for a future state. How will this impact Israel? Well, the only people this deal impacts in Israel are the indigenous Arab population. Hundreds of thousands of them are said to lose their citizenship and have the status of their communities changed. Here's more on that.
Under the newly announced so-called 80-page deal of the century, 14 Arab towns and villages, mainly in the central part of Israel, where more than 300,000 Arab Israelis live, would become part of a Palestinian state.
احنا طبعا ترامب بيقدرش يقرر لنا، ما بيقدر يقرر لأهل هاي البلاد إنه مسكنهم وأصلهم وبلادهم، هو يقرر مصيرهم وين يكونوا وين ما يكونوا. عشان هيك القرار راح يبقى صعب كثير ورد الفعل راح يبقى كثير صعب.
Under the Peace to Prosperity clause in the deal of the century, the status of their communities would change, making them a Palestinian enclave, cut off from the neighboring occupied West Bank by an Israeli barrier known as the Apartheid Wall. The so-called deal would also cut them off from the rest of their families in other towns inside Israel. It would also shrink the Arab population of Israel and erode its influence. Initially, hundreds of thousands of Israeli Arabs would lose their citizenships, followed by more in the longer term. This has irked the Arab population. They account for 21% of the Israeli population. They believe that Israel wants to get rid of their community, their land, their history and space, and in essence, ethnically cleanse pre-1948 Palestine from its original inhabitants. According to the Israeli Arab population, the deal of the century takes all of Jerusalem al-Quds while handing over towns to the Palestinians. Thus, in essence, this would Judaize all of Israel and sets a precedent to banish the rest of the 1.8 million Arabs in Israel.
More questions still remain, including why is it that only the Arab population of Israel or those of Palestinian origin are impacted by this deal from the Israeli side? Or is the concept of transferring the Arab population outside of Israel new? More importantly, why does the Israeli regime want to transfer hundreds of thousands of Arabs outside of Israel? This next exclusive case study from Israel aims to shed light on these lingering questions.
Why is that in Israel it is the Arab population that is impacted by the deal of century?
We are part of the Palestinian people, and what affects the Palestinian people affects, of course, us here in Israel as a national minority. We are today about 1.5 million, so we are a substantial part of the Palestinian people. The deal of the century denies the right of Palestinians for self-determination in a sovereign state alongside Israel, and this is a clear reason why to reject this plan. In addition, the plan includes a specific provision, specific article that refers to the Arab-Palestinian community within Israel. It's that article about basically transferring the community in the Triangle area to the Palestinian side. This, of course, affects directly our community, and we reject that as part of the rejection of the entire plan.
Okay. Did this come as a surprise to Arabs, or was this idea already being floated?
I must say that during the last few years, I have been hearing these ideas in the Knesset from leading Israeli ministers. All over throughout the last few years, I have been hearing Netanyahu himself, but also ministers like Smotrich and others. They have been speaking of annexing the settlements to Israel, speaking of a Palestinian entity that will not have a real sovereignty and will not have borders with any of the neighboring countries. They speak of Jerusalem as it will be united and complete under the sovereignty of Israel, which means denying any rights for Palestinians in Jerusalem. So I have been hearing all these ideas throughout the last few years from leading Israeli officials from the extreme right wing. All of the sudden, these ideas now are part of an American plan. I have to say, though, that provision about the triangle area that relates to the Arab-Palestinian citizen of Israel, for us came as a surprise. And the reason for that is that this idea has been voiced in the last few years by the extreme right, by Lieberman, who used to be the Minister of the Defense, and and other Israeli officials from the extreme right wing. And now we see, this provision as part of an American deal. So for us, it came as a surprise that the American deal adopted such an extreme right-wing idea. But maybe it's part of the entire plan now that the American administration has adopted the visions and the strategies of the right wing in Israel. And I see some kind of a coalition now between the right wing in Israel led by Netanyahu, the right wing in the US led by President Trump. And I must say this becomes very dangerous to peace and stability in our region, because the basis for this coalition is the denial of the Palestinian right for self-determination, which means basically perpetuating the conflict in this region.
Okay, Doctor. Why does you think that the Israel government want to transfer hundreds of thousands of Palestinians?
This is a clearly racist idea. If we ask what's the motivation behind this plan and this specific idea regarding the triangle, the answer is very clear. The idea is to have less Arabs within Israel. So to get rid of over 300,000 Arab citizens, which would make our struggle here in Israel weaker and will make it easier for Israel to develop its control policies over the Arab community. In fact, there is also willingness of Netanyahu and the right wing to weaken the political struggle of Arabs in Israel, and also to weaken our representation in the Knesset, as this will mean less political power for our community. So this is a clear racist idea. We cannot cooperate with this racist idea. In addition, the idea speaks about basically transferring our community under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian side. However, in the Palestinian side, there is no sovereignty and there is no state. What is there actually, according to the Trump plan, is a regime of apartheid. So it's basically trying to say that the government of Israel and the US are willing to strip Arab citizens from their citizenship while having them under a regime of apartheid, and this is something that we cannot, of course, accept.
So this
Transfer.
Okay, sure. Okay.
This transfer.
Okay, مش رح أسأل. How will this affect families? Is it going to another Nakba?
It could be in a practice, yes. For our generation, it's another Nakba. It's a sort of Nakba for our community. First of all, we have extended the lands all over the country, and not just in our residential areas. So as part of the Palestinian people, we have extended historical rights that we are demanding. Many of us here in the Triangle are uprooted Palestinians, which means that they are internally displaced citizens. Our original villages were destroyed back in 48 during the Nakba. We are still demanding, and we will continue to demand returning to our destroy the villages like Lajon and Mzinat and El Kafrin. And this demand basically will be impossible if they implement this transfer. So maybe the idea is not to uproot us from our homes, but it's definitely to uproot us from our historical lands and to deny our right in these lands. So for us, this is an important issue. And another issue, of course, is our family relation with our extended community all over Israel, in the Arab Palestinian communities in the Galilee, like in Nazareth, in the south, in Haifa, in Acre, in Lid, Ramle. So we have extended the family all over, first relation family. But we also have economic times, our businesses, our trade, and also our social life is all over. So it's a racist idea that also would definitely affect our social fabric and affect our economy. Of course, another aspect to add of that being in the Palestinian side would mean also that we will be under regime of oppression and of apartheid, and we will not be part of a Palestinian state as the plan in one hand speaks of a Palestinian state, but actually, and on the ground, it will not be a state. This is a clearly a manipulation of the situation. What we will have, according to the Trump plan, is basically a apartheid state controlled by Israel, in which Palestinians will continue to be under occupation. This goes against the international community consensus about the need to establish a Palestinian state alongside Israel, and the right of Palestinians to have their independent state and to fulfill the right for self-determination just as any other people in the world.
Okay, question number 6. Does Israel seek to eventually transfer all Israel or all Arabs out of Israel?
Some politicians in Israel in the right wing says that they don't accept the idea that in one hand the Palestinian entity will not have any Jews and it will be only an entirely Palestinian entity. I don't call it a state because it's not state according to the right wing suggestion. But they saw also that they cannot accept the fact that Israel will continue to have 20% of its population are Palestinians. However, our message is very clear. We are here because we are in our homeland. We didn't immigrate to this land. We are the indigenous, we are the native community of this land, and we will struggle on our land. We are here to remain here, and we will reject and challenge and defeat all these racist and fascist idea of transferring population, not just changing the borders. Also, speaking of changing the borders itself is basically a cover for an actual transfer and another Nakba for Palestinians within Israel.
Mm-hmm. What actions can the Arabs take in light of such conspiracies against them?
Our rejection of the American deal is part of the Palestinian rejection, part of the Arab world rejection, and part of the international community rejection, because there is an international consensus about the right of Palestinians to have independent Palestinian state alongside Israel. So we will continue to struggle to achieve this goal with the support of international organizations and the international institutions. We believe that the Palestinian struggle is enough fair and enough justice, so that all the international community should interfere in order to protect these historical national rights of Palestinians. Here within Israel, we are in the joint list now, the third largest party. We have 15 seats of the 120 seats in the parliament, and we will do our best from this position as a representative of the Arab community in Israel in the Knesset. We will do our best to challenge the Israeli policy of denying Palestinian rights, and we will represent the cause of peace that basically go through the establishment of a Palestinian state. We will do that in the Knesset, we will do that in the international institutions and through our international relation, and we will do that also in the ground through mass mobilization of our people and of our community in peaceful demonstrations and peaceful marches against this dangerous denial of our basic rights. First of all, as a people, to have a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital of the Palestinian state, and also to struggle to achieve our rights within Israel for full equality as individual citizens, but also as a national and cultural native minority.
Okay. Remember, Doctor, the proposal to transfer hundreds of thousands of Arabs out of Israel comes after the Israeli Arab population made significant political gains to a point where they almost become kingmakers in the last elections. What political implication does this have?
I believe that Netanyahu included this provision about the transfer of the Arab community of the Triangle in advance of the election as part of his campaign against Arab citizens and against the Joint List, the political representative of Arab citizens in Israel. Netanyahu knows that we are influential and that our votes affect the national map in Israel and could affect who will be the prime minister in Israel. This is the reason why he is trying to weaken our struggle, to weaken our political maneuver and political activity. And part of that is basically to have less Arabs and basically to have less voters and less representatives in the Knesset. This is a clearly racist motivation. Netanyahu is very worried about our gradually influential role within Israeli politics, and he knows that without us, he would have a majority in the Knesset. But for us, this is a good reason why to basically to actively participate in the political process, to go out and vote. And we are happy that our community was really active in the last election and gave us its full support. And the result is that the additional two seats that we gained in the last election basically prevented Netanyahu from guaranteeing the 61 seats that he needs for his right-wing, extreme right-wing government. This is an important achievement for our community, and hopefully we will continue to gain more political power as long as our community is very supportive to our vision and to our political platform.
Last question. What are the politics behind the possible transferring of hundreds of thousands of Arabs from Israel? What does Israel want to do exactly?
The right wing in Israel is trying to get rid of Arab citizens in order to have less Arabs in Israel and less influence for Arab citizens on the national politics within Israel. And the direct result would be to have less Arabs in the Knesset and in the parliament. That will enable the right wing to have a strong control over the national politics and basically to keep us away from any attempt to try the national politics. In fact, what the right wing in Israel is trying to do is basically to have the politics in Israel without Arabs. But we are saying that We are here as an indigenous community. We exercise our basic right to vote and to be in the Knesset. This is part of our struggle to protect our rights, to protect our existence, to protect our identity, and we will continue to use this right in order to continue to protect our march for first-class citizenship in Israel.
Rabbi Joseph Cohn from the Neturei Karta International joins us from New York to discuss these challenges. Thank you for being with us, Rabbi. Now, from what we know under the so-called deal of the century, the indigenous Arab population will have to be relocated. What would this lead to?
This is indeed against international law, and it's also against the Jewish religion, because any form of land theft and expulsion and stealing of people's property is forbidden according to Jewish belief, and it's a crime against humanity, and it's indeed against international law.
Well, speaking of population transfer, is that a new concept? I mean, how far does this go back?
This is a plan that allows the occupation to continue in large part, and we have to examine the root cause of the problem. This state of Israel has been established on Palestinian land. In 1948, the creation of the state of Israel was on Palestinian land, and this is an illegal occupation, and this has been going on for decades now, and Israel does not stop. They continue to occupy more and more land and to kill more and more Palestinians, and now they are attempting to uproot the Palestinians of more of their own villages and towns. And of course, this is heartbreaking when we see the crime against the Palestinians.
Now, what do you think the Israeli agenda is behind the decision to transfer hundreds of thousands of Arabs from inside Israel?
The entire ideology of Zionism is rooted in heresy. It was invented by people who detested God and who left the Jewish religion, and they're criminals. The entire ideology of creating their state in other people's land is a criminal. It's criminal. Now, whatever they're doing, whatever comes out of this main crime called the State of Israel is criminal. They're constantly trying to confiscate more and more of what's not theirs, and they're always trying to wage wars and to kill more and more people and to kick more people out of their homes and towns.
Well, how does the Jewish population outside of Israel generally feel about this? What do these new developments implicate?
One of the things this peace deal offers is to allow Israel to call Jerusalem the capital of Israel, which of course is in total violation of international law, and it's a violation of it's a crime against humanity. It's against the Jewish religion. Jerusalem does not belong for the Jews, and what the Zionists are doing, they're using our Torah, our religion, to justify their crimes.
Thank you for that, Rabbi Cohn. That was Rabbi Joseph Cohn from New York. On the streets of Israel, our crew asked people a few questions on the topic of the deal of the century. We started out with this question: how would the deal of the century impact you?
העסקה הזאת היא העסקה לא הראשונה בהיסטוריה שלנו, תמיד. הם מוכרים, כמו תמיד, את הפלסטינים ואת העם הפלסטיני ואת האדמות הפלסטינים. מתנהלים כאילו שאין לנו ראש. אבל אני מקווה שהעם הפלסטיני יישאר כמו שהוא, דבוק באדמתו, ונקווה לטוב.
אני חושבת שלבטל אזרחות זה פשע. מי שלא עשה שום דבר נגד המדינה, הוא פשוט אזרח של המדינה, הוא קיבל את האזרחות יחד עם כולנו בקום המדינה. אני חושבת שהוא צריך להישאר אזרח.
طبعا أكيد كأنا أحد أبناء الشعب الفلسطيني عندنا تخوف كبير جدا في وسطنا العربي من صفقة القرن لأنه هناك خبايا في صفقة القرن راح يحطوا المواطنين العرب في الداخل الفلسطيني، وهذا جدا مؤثر، وإحنا بنعيش ببلبلة حاليا. ولكن الانتخابات اللي أجت علينا في بداية الشهر سطر شعبنا أسمى آيات الكبرياء والغطرسة الإسرائيلية في تصويت للقائمة المشتركة. فهذا كان مهم جدا، خروج شعبنا لصناديق الاقتراع لاختيار قادتنا في القائمة المشتركة ולדפע عنا داخل البرلمان الإسرائيلي.
רעיון העיוויים זה רעיון מפגר לדעתי. אין שום היגיון. אזרחי ישראל הם ערבים, יהודים, כל דת או כל דבר אחר. מישהו אזרח ישראלי או אזרח ישראלי בעיניי. לכן אני לא מוצא שום טעם ברעיונות כאלה שאין להם שום מקום במציאות שלי.
The Israeli Arabs are Palestinians who have stayed behind after Israel's inception onto Palestinian lands in 1948. They represent 21% of the Israeli population, which is a significant portion. The indigenous Arab population has always complained of being marginalized and targeted by the regime. But to be the target of transfers in the so-called deal of the century is a whole other threat to them, something they're not planning to take without a fight. Here's more on that.
Israel's Arabs, predominantly Muslims, Christians, and Druze, are mostly the descendants of the Palestinians who remained in their homes or were internally displaced following the 1948 Nakba that surrounded Israel's inception. Many identify as Palestinians and regularly voice solidarity with those in the besieged Gaza Strip and the occupied West Bank. They now fear losing their rights and ties to the land they have lived on for generations if they are moved from Israel to Palestinian rule in the West Bank. Arab Israelis are already treated as second-class citizens. They have always complained of marginalization and systematic discrimination. They cite Israeli laws, such as the so-called nation-state law, that further downgraded them and their language. Thousands of Israeli Arabs in Israel have taken to the streets to voice their rejection of the deal. Protests have been going on every day since the announcement of the so-called deal of the century.
إسرائيل تريد أن تتخلص من هؤلاء المواطنين الذين يعيشون في أرضهم وفي وطنهم وفي فضائهم وفي تاريخهم، تتخلص منهم بدعوى أنها تريد أن تعوض الفلسطينيين على ما سلبه المستوطنون. يعني بدها تعوض الفلسطينيين بأرض فلسطين. هذا أمر غير مقبول.
According to them, this is an attempt to enhance ideologies that support population transfer by using political tools to get rid of the Arab citizens rather than physically removing people from their homes. The motivations are racial, to preserve demographic superiority.
هذا الجزء الأصيل من الشعب الفلسطيني ينتفض ضد صفقة القرن، لأن صفقة القرن لا تهدف إلى إقامة دولة فلسطينية صغيرة إلى جانب إسرائيل، وإنما تهدف إلى القضاء على القضية الفلسطينية.
The initiative would also have the tragic impact on many families by tearing them apart. For example, two siblings attending school in one of the towns to be transferred would not be able to visit their mother and father in pre-1948 occupied territories such as Haifa.
This is a very serious issue indeed. Radio host and political commentator Charles Dunaway joins us from Oregon to discuss the issue in detail. Great to have you with us, Mr. Dunaway. Now, here's my first question for you. What does the Zionist regime seek when it announces plans to transfer hundreds of thousands of children, women, and men from inside Israel?
Israel is facing a demographic challenge. The number of Palestinian citizens is increasing far more rapidly than Jewish citizens, and to keep their vaunted status as a democracy, they'll be forced to give up their status as a nation-state for the Jews. And jettisoning several thousand Palestinians will keep the Jews the majority much longer. This plan will remove 350,000 Palestinians from Israel, nearly a fifth of those currently living there. And Trump has drastically reduced funding for the Palestinian Authority, the UNRWA, and the new budget calls for removing the remaining funding for the Palestinian Authority unless they agree to his so-called peace plan. Given the tactics of the Trump administration and the Zionist regime, they're likely to institute a maximum pressure campaign on the Palestinian people to force them to accept this Bantustan plan.
Well, Palestinian citizens or Arab Israelis have for years complained of discrimination. Can you please elaborate on this issue?
As the Israeli regime has moved further and further to the right, the rhetoric and the actions of its politicians are becoming even more threatening to Palestinian rights. Already the Israeli law discriminates against Palestinian citizens in numerous ways, including the denial of rights to build homes in villages, the demolition of homes and schools built without these unobtainable permits, and Palestinians are blocked from ownership of 80% of Israeli land and prohibited from bringing a spouse into Israel from the occupied territories. With this plan in place, Israel is unlikely to feel any inhibition about stripping Palestinians of their citizenship rights altogether and making their lives even more miserable.
Now, what do you think would happen if hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forced to leave Israel tomorrow and be out in a small isolated borough?
Virulent anti-Arab racism has accompanied the growing power of right-wing Israeli parties and can only mean greater danger for Palestinians wherever they are. Palestinians inside Israel have at least some legal guarantees and rights under the Israeli court system, but in the territories they would be subject to military law, which allows, among other things, administrative detention, in which Palestinians have been held without charges or trials for years and years. Though second and third class citizens in Israel, Palestinians could find some comfort in a status quo, but within the context of the New Deal, everything seems to be on the table, including that status quo.
Now, do you think Israel is looking to rid itself of its minorities under the pretext of the so-called deal of the century?
Many of the early Zionist leaders openly stated the desire for a pure Jewish state in Israel without Arabs. And the Trump administration seems to be sending the Israeli government the signal that the U.S. will back anything they do. So if they create a phony state under their total control, they'll probably work to encourage remaining Palestinian citizens to leave Israel. They could provide financial incentives, but the encouragement could also turn to forcible ejection if they refuse to leave their homes. And we have to ask, how long will it be before the Zionists tire of having even this amount of land unavailable for Jewish settlement?
Thank you for joining us, Mr. Dunaway. That was radio host and political commentator Charles Dunaway from Oregon. It's now time to look at news stories from Israel. Times of Israel. Female plaintiff seeks $20,000 in damages for December 2018 incident when railroad attendants asked her to change cars so men could pray according to gender segregation guidelines. Haaretz. Israeli schools aren't teaching, so tutors are doing it for them. Teacher shortage and overcrowded classrooms leave parents no choice but to seek private help, even for young children. Ynet. Israel hits back at UN for settlement blacklist, freezes ties with human rights chief. Palestinian PM hails victory for international law. Ynet. Six-offender rabbi arrested for fraud tax evasion. Supporters riot as Eliezer Berland, 82, is arrested with 5 others, including his wife. The 6 suspects accused of violations worth of hundreds of millions of shekels.